First Things, episode number 29.
I seem to be lost.
And so you're working around the clock, so you don't take time for yourself to feel like an actual human being.
I used to feel like no matter how hard I worked, I was just spinning my wheels.
Trying to be perfect, we try to have everything in place at one point in time, and you can't.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to First Things, the podcast dedicated to practical productivity based on modern research. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and my goal is to help you apply productive solutions to your life to help you live with less stress, greater passion, and amazing results. So glad to have you back for the 29th episode. And I've told you before in the past, if you've listened to me for any bit of time, that I just like numbers. I'm a numbers guy, and I look and say, wow, I am almost to 30 episodes. I cannot believe this. It seems like yesterday when I started this, and here I am in 30 episodes later, 30 episodes as of next week. And I find it very fitting that our 30th episode begins a new series for us, a series over assertiveness, how to say no to things in life, how to say no to manipulation and guilt and condemnation and all these types of things that we heap upon ourselves, other people heap upon ourselves. I've mentioned to you in times past that two of my most popular episodes have been over the happiness episode and over the assertiveness episode, and I think the assertiveness episode has been my most popular to date. And this is why I am trumping the happiness for just a moment and looking at the issue of assertiveness for a while. And I know that some of you may be disappointed because I've said forever now that I was going to go back to the happiness episode. And trust me, I have not forgotten. I am still going to go back to there. And we're going to do very much like we've done here. We're going to really dive deep into the issue of happiness and see what all that is about. But quite honestly, I feel like I need a little bit more time to digest a lot of the materials I've been researching on that. So I want to hold that off just for a little bit, so if you can please be patient with me on that. I do promise I have not forgotten. We will come back to that. But starting next week, we are going to dive into the issue of assertiveness. And I have a link to two books on my website, firstthingsproductivity.com/29. For this episode, you will see the two references there. One of them is called the Assertiveness Workbook, which is going to be our primary resource as we go through this. And then another book that will serve as kind of a supplementary study for us will be When I Say No, I Feel Guilty, which is a classic text on assertiveness that we will go into in bits and pieces as well. Would highly encourage that you pick those up and start looking through them, skimming through them before next week. Although next week we will introduce the topic of it, and then we will start getting into some of the materials following the next week. Again, you don't have to have those materials. You can just listen and absorb, and I'm going to distill a lot of that information here, add my own bits and pieces into this. But it just helps if it resonates with you and you want to have a deeper study in it, then those are the materials you want to pick up to do so. Now, today I have a special guest on the show, and this special guest is Timothy Moser. Now, you can find Timothy at aceproductivity.com, aceproductivity.com. You can find him on iTunes, and as a podcast, he has Ace Productivity as well. And Tim's been doing a great job in doing all of this stuff. Let me read his bio from his site. He says, "My name is Timothy Moser, and I love life. Like anything or anyone I love, I want my life to be the best it can be. Since life is measured by time, that means making the best use of my time that I can. I want to get the most from my time, and I'm always exploring the best way to do that." Now, Timothy has been a huge fan of this show for the longest time, and I mentioned to him how much I appreciate him because he's been so encouraging of me and this podcast from the very beginning. So I am recommending you to him, not just because of that. If nothing else, yes, for that, because he's been a huge supporter of me and the podcast, but also because he's a great guy and he has some really great insights into things, and that's why I'm bringing him here today. Now, Timothy's also interviewed me, so I would recommend, if you like me or you like the things I say or the way I think about things, the crazy way that I do think about things, then check out his podcast, because I think around the time that you hear this, he will probably have already published the interview that he did with me and about viewing life from different perspectives of what we've been talking about, even the procrastination thing. But today, I am talking to Timothy about him. And in particular, I'm talking about his view of life as an experiment or a project. And this has fascinated me when I've listened to his podcast and also read his blog about how he views his life as an experiment, how he views his life as a project. And I've mentioned that I love research. This whole show is based upon research-based things. But I find that many people, when they hear research, they hear the average result. And the average is just meant to be a summary of where a lot of people may be, but it's not everyone. And in fact, some people may be less or more than a particular thing. So if it comes back and says the average person needs 7 hours of sleep, well, many people take that as the end state, that it's 7 hours, when actually some people may need more, some people may need less. But if you use 7 as a starting point instead of as an end point, it would make a huge difference, because at least you know maybe where to start experimenting with your life. And I love this. I love the experimental mode that I approach in life as well. And so I'm talking to Tim today about this particular topic. So I hope you enjoy this. Let's go right now to this interview with Timothy. Well, Timothy, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. I've told many of my listeners for quite some time how incredibly supportive you've been of me and the show, and how encouraging it's been to me. So if you could just tell my listeners a little bit more about yourself, some of the things that you're involved in with your blog, your podcast, and different things like that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy your show. I think that there's, been a need for a long time for really practical productivity advice in iTunes. And as you say, I think that our shows really complement each other really well. So I think that we're really, hopefully, meeting a need that's out there. But yeah, ACE Productivity is, I describe it as a lifestyle productivity show. It started as a blog about 8 months ago, and while I didn't have very many readers, I was basically using it to put out all of my thoughts on productivity, on what makes people, work in their lives, in their work and their leisure, whatever it is, make the best use of their time and really reflect what excites them in their lives. And so while I've basically turned it into a podcast, I still occasionally make posts on the blog, and I do guest posts for other blogs occasionally. But basically we talk about lifestyle productivity, which is not just, looking at your own schedule and saying, how do I, optimize my time, but also just looking at your whole life and saying, how is my, what is the value that I want to get out of my career? What's the value I want to get out of my hobbies? And just evaluating, how can I get that to the best extent? How can I maximize the value of my time by doing the things that will push me to get the best value I can out of them? So I'm kind of about, in the moment, making yourself do more. I like to talk a lot about behavioral psychology and, the moment by moment, how to force yourself to get out of bed in the morning, and, little things like that just keep you going. And then ultimately, my favorite thing to talk about is just the concept of value, and thinking in any given moment, there's some sort of value that you're trying to get out of it, whether it's, if you're doing work for your business, the values you want to get out of that obviously are to make money and to create a good image of yourself or whatever. You just have to define what that is and then get the best out of it. And then, for other areas of your life, if what you're doing is, let's say, mowing the lawn, and well, what you're wanting to get out of that is just to get the grass cut and maybe to get some exercise. But you can question that kind of thing and say, well, if all I want is to get the grass cut and to get some exercise, is this the best way to do it? Or could I maybe instead do jumping jacks while my son cuts the grass? Or, right. But it's just rethinking everything and saying, what is it that I'm trying to get out of this time, and how can I maximize the benefits?
Yeah, I think our podcasts really complement each other. I remember when you first started your podcast, I thought, oh, this is great. Timothy's making a podcast, and I wonder how it's going to differ from what I've done. And I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast, and we really do tend to complement each other. I think we definitely overlap on certain parts because we have a very focused on value, like you said, and about this positive aspect of who we are in this world. Mm-hmm. But I definitely, and one of the things I really love that I've read in your blog, I've heard on your podcast, is your view on experimenting with yourself. And coming from an academic background where I love doing research, one of the things I always saw in my own self was that my life was an experiment. And I think you've said once that you view life as a project. And I find too many people forget that when they read these research reports that it basically is just reporting an average, but that isn't what everyone is like. There's variability on either side. So I wanted to ask, why do you think that experimenting in life is a habit that people should embrace? Because this is one of the things I love about you and what you write, is this idea of experimenting with life. But why do you think that this is a habit that people should embrace in their life?
Well, first of all, I get a lot of my inspiration from Tim Ferriss, and in the 4-hour work week, and especially in the 4-hour body, he talks about self-experimentation, and he has some guest authors who describe that, even some researchers who talk about the benefits of, about the benefits of self-experimentation over statistical experimentation, because the fact is, as you say, every human is different. There's no such thing as the average human being. So if you want to know what works best for you, you don't want to find out, you can't completely depend on the average. So if for the average person, they require 7.8 hours of sleep per night to feel well rested, that does not apply to everybody. Some people can, need actually 11 hours of sleep per night. And there's a small percentage of people who need only a few hours of sleep, but you have to know yourself really well. So really for me, one of my biggest values is just getting to know myself and knowing what works best for me. And, as I said, I like to talk about behavioral psychology. It's a subject that interests me. I'm not an expert, but I like to read things and try them out, just to see how I can form my own habits. And again, a big part of that is just knowing yourself. So my favorite example is just getting up in the morning. I've tried all sorts of things to convince myself to get up early in the morning. And I mean, willpower is one thing, but the fact is you have a limited willpower to get up. So if you tell yourself the night before, okay, this time I'm really going to get up tomorrow, in the morning, you aren't going to be thinking the same way. Your mind is going to be in a different state, and you will turn the alarm off and go back to sleep. So if you're living the
I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah. I mean, if you keep telling yourself and try to guilt yourself into it, you're going to feel that guilt during the day. Then you won't feel it in the morning, or maybe you will, but it won't convince you. And so, I mean, I'm really not in favor of just living your life filled with guilt. That really doesn't help much. I mean, obviously, if you offend another party, you want to apologize to them and make it right. But feeling guilty with yourself over your own failures isn't going to help anything. Instead, figure out why you're making the wrong decision and then find a way to make it work. So, I figured out a way to get myself out of bed in the morning, and it worked for a while. And I'm working on another project right now to try a different approach. But it's just really interesting to see, what works best for me. And then for most of my life, I pretty much ate the same way. I would choose these foods over these foods for arbitrary reasons, I guess. But more recently, having looked at a lot of different opinions on the subject and some consensus that I didn't really, is consensus the right term? I don't know. Consensuses that I was seeing, about avoiding fast carbs and things like that. I decided, I'm going to try basically semi-slow carbing for a while and see what that does for me. And I found myself, it was really nice while I was doing it. It was interesting on the days that I was slow carbing, because I wasn't doing it fully. I was just doing it basically 4 days a week. But on the days that I did it, I felt energy. I didn't feel hungry, and it really seemed to be working well for me. Plus, the way that I was doing it was really cheap for my grocery budget. So that was an added benefit. But basically, just trying different things in your life and seeing what works for you, it's a really great habit to have, because if you do the same things that you've done your whole life, even if you think that it's the right thing, you don't know, because you can't compare it to anything else. You can compare yourself to other people, but ultimately it all comes down to you again. So
right.
That's really my view on experimentation.
Yeah, I find for me that if people would approach these types of studies as a starting point and not as the end point, it would make a huge difference, because I I find what a lot of people do is they take these studies and they just assume that they're at the end state, when to me they're really at the beginning of a journey if they want to use this as a springboard and say, okay, if this is what the average person is like, let me start there at least, but it may not be where I end up. Like I've heard a lot of studies on how morning people are more productive than other people. And, quite honestly, I've just, for me personally, I've always lived under this guilt and condemnation if I couldn't be that. And then to come to realization, no, maybe this is the average person more productive in the morning, but that doesn't necessarily mean I will be. Yeah. And there, I have to tailor this to my own life. And that's hard, I think, for a lot of people to realize if they start with these research studies as the end goal, don't realize it's just the beginning of something.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because people will hit it over your head all the time. The morning people will say, you should be getting up earlier. You'll get so much more done. But I tend to sit in that camp, even though I do sleep in once in a while and don't necessarily feel good about it. But I mean, then I realized that my two of my biggest inspirations for my own content, Pat Flynn and Tim Ferriss, are both very anti-morning type of people. They both do their work late at night and sleep in late in the morning. So, I mean, I can't make that blanket statement because two of the most productive people that I know of and two of my biggest inspirations are not morning people at all. So is there one or two things? I know you've mentioned some examples, and these may be the examples that you would cite for this, but I'm curious if there's been anything really astonishing, any astonishing insights that you've gained from experimenting in your life. Is there something that you experimented and it's like, wow, this was the exact opposite of what I thought it would be like for me in my life? And it made a radical, huge difference for how you dealt with life, productivity, eating, exercise, just anything. Yeah, so one thing is, even before I was self-experimenting, way back when I was a teenager, I used to do hundreds and hundreds of push-ups. I just arbitrarily thought that was a good thing to do, and I did them a lot. But I think that in the end, doing up to 1,000 push-ups a day really wrecked my wrists. So I actually have stress injuries in my wrists and can not do things. So the biggest thing I would say for anybody who's experimenting is, if you think no pain, no gain, that's a really dangerous camp to be in, especially for someone who, is an athlete or a musician or whatever, because you can do permanent damage to yourself if you don't have a trainer and if you don't have somebody who's telling you what's right or wrong. And similar to that, more recently with experiments, I was doing a sleep experiment that required a very strict schedule of sleep, but ultimately only allowed me a total of 4 hours of sleep per 24 hours. Theoretically, I'd be training my body to be able to stay up that long. But the fact is, I got a cold during that time, and I don't get sick that easily. I'm fairly resistant to sickness, but it just went really bad, and it was terrible. And so for from getting up at 4 a.m. to going to bed at 12:30 p.m., I just felt miserable all day long and could not get anything done. So even though I was really stubborn and trying to carry out the experiment, I basically had to give up. So don't sacrifice your health for experiments. Don't try out, overdosing on a new drug or something that comes out. Really be careful the way that you experiment. But on a more positive note, I have discovered some interesting things that, they kind of just make sense. But obviously, the no high glycemic carbs on most days of the week has really been good for me, because when I do eat high glycemic carbs, it seems like I always end up crashing and feeling terrible. But then also, as far as sleep goes, I find that if I set my alarm for the same time every morning, I find it really easy to get up. Now, again, I have been an early riser most of my life, and so for my most common alarm time is actually 4 a.m., and I'm not really getting up at that time right now, but I find that if I set my alarm for that time, when I wake up at that time, the alarm goes off and I feel like I could just spring out of bed and do stuff. Maybe I don't necessarily want to be jumping up and down on the bed at that hour, but I do feel like I could get up and get stuff done. And sometimes I do. I'll get up for a little while and read. I feel just fine because my body is in a state to wake up at that time. You know, the body goes through states of deeper and lighter sleep throughout the night, but if it's used to a specific wake up time, it will be ready to wake up at that moment. So some people would say, you know, I woke up right before the alarm went off. I just lost those 2 minutes of sleep. But in reality, you know, that it's actually better for them. You wake up at 5:28 before your alarm goes off at 5:30. That's really good for you because your alarm isn't interrupting deep sleep. So that's my biggest tip actually for sleeping, is just getting up at a regular time every morning.
Yeah, your studies that you've done on yourself with sleep was really fascinating to me. You introduced me to some aspects of sleep patterns that I had never really heard or studied before. I had done a lot of studies, you know, in terms of the sleep cycles and how maybe waking up during certain parts of the sleep cycles are much better or easier to wake up in. But a lot of the things that you were experimenting with your life, doing stages of sleeps during various parts of the day to kind of make up for just one long period of sleep was fascinating to me. And I saw there was a lot of studies of people who've been doing this for years all over the world. Mm-hmm. And so that was fascinating. I mean, for most of us, it's probably common sense, but what does sleep and productivity mean to you personally? And what's the link there for you?
Well, I think that there's almost nothing you can do better for your productivity other than just knowing the right things to do. If you are in a good state of physical and mental energy, you can get a lot more done than if you aren't. In college, for example, I skipped on sleep a lot. I had long days because I commuted, and basically I was getting 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. And then first thing in the morning, I would try to do reading. And so I'd get up and I'd be really drowsy, but I'd try to read. And actually it was a huge mistake because it's been really terrible for me because, I mean, now I'm actually a much slower reader than most people would guess. I'm a really unfocused reader. I'm really trying to train myself now actually to read more quickly, but I'm a terribly slow reader. I get so distracted, my thoughts drift so easily, and it's all because I developed this habit in college of reading without good focus. I was drowsy, I couldn't focus, and it basically took me 5 times as long to read anything as it should have. I could read the same sentence over and over and not think of anything. And now, if I get 8 hours of sleep, which is pretty much what it takes for unless I'm getting on a really good schedule, it takes about 8 hours of sleep for me to feel fully myself. But if I have that, I can read so much faster. I can, I feel so much more creative. I just feel so much better, so much more positive. And you may think that, again, we should push ourselves into, doing things that are difficult and don't feel natural. But I really think that just putting ourselves in a natural, more state, just giving our bodies what they need, not just what they want, but what they need, and making the right thing easier to do is just a really healthy way to live.
Yeah, when you mentioned that about the college, training yourself to think a certain way, that made me really think. I want to reflect on that a lot more because I've faced some of the same battles myself. With all of the stuff I've done in the academic world, people might think I'm just a ferocious reader as well, but it's an area that I've struggled with, and focus and intention. A lot of times I found recently that if I listen to an audio book and read the book at the same time, even though it may be a little bit slower, it helps me focus some. And I've often wondered, why am I not a stronger reader? But I can look back in college days and high school days when I wasn't getting a lot of sleep, and how maybe I trained myself in that state of not being as focused to be an inefficient reader. So I think that's fascinating. I never made that connection before.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with you. I think that, and I do the same thing sometimes. I'll read something while listening to it, or with TED Talks, sometimes I'll watch the video at 2 or 3, maybe 4 times the speed because I have an app that lets me do that, while reading the transcript, and I can consume the information so much better and understand it so much better because I'm so much more focused. More than one of my senses is involved. But I'd say for anyone listening, do what you can to make sure that whatever you're doing, you're as focused as you can be on the one thing you're doing. And if that requires you to do something, with yourself physically, to take better care of yourself by sleeping more, exercising more. One of the biggest is drinking more water. 75% of Americans are dehydrated. So, that's one of the biggest things, I think, and one of the reasons that my health is at such a high level, even though I don't exercise so much. But, just do your research and know what you should be doing with your body, because if you don't take care of your body won't take care of you.
You recently did a podcast on the topic that discipline is a myth. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by that. And of course, anyone who's listening to this, you can go to your website, and I'll put a link in the show notes for them to go to some of these episodes. But what do you mean by discipline is a myth?
Yeah, sometimes I'll use a somewhat controversial title like that just to get people's attention, but I only do it when I actually believe that it's true. And I'm not alone here. I'm not the only one who thinks that the popular concept of discipline is just completely false. So when people talk about discipline, they tend to be thinking of willpower. And I'll use the 4 a.m. example again. When I was in high school, I would frequently get up really early in the morning, and I would get up and do, schoolwork or homework, and I'd be sitting there working, and it would be for hours before anyone else was up, and it was great. I was in the zone working, and it was easy for me because I was used to getting up at that time. Well, if somebody else had to come along and get up, at 4:30 in the morning to catch a flight or something, and they saw me already up and working, they would look at me and they go, "Wow, I wish I had your discipline." And I frankly think that doesn't make any sense, because it wasn't that I was, fighting and making myself do it. I wasn't, fighting an internal battle or anything. It was just natural for me to get up at that time. I mean, is somebody in California going to call somebody in New York early in the morning and say, "Wow, you got up 3 hours earlier than me. I wish I had your discipline"? No, they got up 3 hours earlier because the sun comes up 3 hours earlier for them. They're on an earlier schedule. And that's how it was for me. I was on an earlier schedule, so it was easy for me to do it. So really what discipline or personal habits come down to is just making the right thing easier to do for you, making the decision easy. And, when it comes down to it, you're going to do what your willpower wants you to do. Again, going back to getting up in the morning, if you are, if you're able to get up every morning at a specific time, it's because you have that habit and it's easy for you. When you make the decision in the morning, you make the right decision. If anything comes down to making a decision, you're going to decide whatever wins out. So, it's a conflict of will, and whichever will is stronger will win. And so you can't just beat something by trying to exert stronger willpower over something, because the fact is, whichever desire is stronger in the moment of the decision is going to win out in the end. So what it really comes down to is developing good habits and knowing what you want. And then again, just knowing yourself really well, experimenting with yourself, and knowing how to convince yourself to do the right thing at the right time.
Now, I know you're a big proponent, as I am, of seeing life, from a more positive aspect. And, one of the things that I've dealt with in my own life, some of the things I've talked about on my podcast, is dealing with what I term stinking thinking, which is not original to me. But do you have any suggestions for a person who has a tendency toward negative thinking to start reversing this trend? What would you say, either to someone that friends with, someone that you're talking to and encouraging them, to get them to start unprogramming themselves from a lot of negative perspectives of life?
Yeah, a lot of it depends on the context. I mean, I think that There's a difference between positivity versus negativity and happiness versus grief. So one thing that I will say is if somebody is grieving something, that's a completely different subject because it is important to recognize when something tragic happens. But as far as positivity versus negativity goes, if you're dealing with someone who just tends to see things from a negative perspective, who wants to shut things down when there's potential, my perspective is when something goes wrong, that's a call to action to make something better. My view on positivity is that, it may be counterintuitive, but the classic positive versus negative or optimist versus pessimist is that the optimist sees the glass as half full. But for me, if I look at the glass and I see that it's half empty, that there's stuff still to fill, I see that as a positive thing because I see that empty space in the glass and I think, wow, there's a project, there's something to fill. So for me, when I'm trying to show somebody how to think more positively, what I'll do is I'll say, is there something you can improve in your life? Let's work on it. Because there's nothing better you can do with your life than to improve it. That's one of my passions, perhaps my biggest passion, just self-improvement, making yourself a better person, making your life the best that it can be. And so for me, positivity is about recognizing everything that isn't right yet and working to make it right.
Yeah, it's very much an adventure type of thing. Again, it's going back to this idea of an experiment, of always approaching your life as an adventure. And I love your perspective on that, of seeing a glass that's half empty as being an opportunity, not something that's bad, but there's an adventure there to embrace. And I think that's an awesome perspective of life.
Yeah, that's exactly the way I look at it.
So let's talk one last thing today that you started up recently that I had a lot of interest in, and that was in the memory realm. I started seeing some of the things that you are putting together and launching for that, and I remember watching old Harry Lorraine commercials. I don't know if you were even old enough to remember old Harry Lorraine. He used to even be on The Tonight Show back when Johnny Carson was hosting it, and always memorizing the name of everyone in an entire studio audience, and always fascinated by memory and techniques and different things like that. So can you describe what you're doing now in this area, how you're helping people, maybe even a few tricks? I know we don't want to get too into that, and of course they have your site that you're building for this type of thing, but what are you doing in this area right now?
Yeah, basically memory has always been interesting to me. I've always been, again, I'm a learner, I'm a self-improver, so I've always wanted to learn more things and remember more things. I've always wanted to be the human encyclopedia. That's always, been a dream of mine. I haven't necessarily always worked on it, but it's just something I just love to have knowledge. I just love learning. So I'd learned about accelerated learning techniques when I was younger, but I never gave them much credit until more recently. The fact is, Harry Lorraine kind of falls into this subculture of people who basically spend their lives learning how to memorize things really quickly. There are competitions, national and international competitions, where these people who have devoted their lives to this thing, basically, they spend hours memorizing long lists of random digits, the orders of shuffled decks of cards, and long lists of names and faces.
I remember those commercials too.
Yeah. So when I look at that, I go, okay, this is a skill that they've acquired that, as they say, anybody could acquire. And, people do. That's actually how people join this sort of subculture. They go, what? How did you do that? That's impressive. And somebody goes, well, it's simple. You just do, you just train yourself to do this. And they go, oh, okay, that's actually pretty simple. It just takes a lot of training. But I look at that and I say, there's a lot of potential there for actually learning things that are maybe practical to everyday life. So memorizing phone numbers, memorizing vocabulary, learning languages, memorizing quotes. And the fact is, there have always been people for the last 2,000 years, there have been people who have trained their memory so that they can remember things better. It was actually a part of education until basically the 18th century, just learning how to memorize better. And it used to be that when books couldn't be widely distributed, if you read a book, you were expected to remember what was in it. So you had to create, you had to use a memory palace or some, mnemonic technique like that to remember what was in the book, so that once you'd finished going through it, you could go back home and repeat the contents of the book back to people. Nowadays, we tend to consume information and, it goes in one ear and out the other. But, while we have lots of information and that's nice, I think that there's a lost art of memory. So, Peter of Ravenna of, several centuries ago, he memorized 20,000 legal points and lots of facts and quotes and a few hundred books that he could reread in his head during his free time.
Wow.
And that's really, yeah. I mean, can you just imagine, going outside and sitting under a tree and reading, a Harry Potter book in your head? It's just,
it goes to show how far our education system has really drifted from that. I don't want to blame this on technology because I love technology, but it is very interesting that the more technology we get into our lives, that we move away from things like this that I think are greatly needed in our lives, and we neglect those things.
Yeah, I think that with technology and then combining it with these ancient tactics that are, older than the Gregorian calendar, these have been around for a long time. Combining the two of them, we could have better education than ever. I'm not arguing that education was better several hundred years ago, because it wasn't. We didn't have the information that we have now. But if we actually learned how to retain information quickly, and, I'm not selling this stuff, I'm out to make it free to everybody. My site, everything on my site will be completely free, all the information, because the fact is, for hundreds and hundreds of years, well, I shouldn't say hundreds and hundreds, but at least since the beginning of the 19th century, ever since it was taken out of education, people have been swindling people on this stuff for a long time. They'll take the old techniques and then they'll sell them as tricks. They'll either use them as cheap tricks for entertainment purposes, or they'll, sell them in a scammy way. Mark Twain was kind of swindled on this because he paid lots and lots of money to learn these tactics. But then he realized later, oh, that's just ancient stuff that's been around for a long time. So it's been kind of a scammy field in the past. People, telling you, oh, you can make better use of your brain and your brain will grow. But for me, I just think that everybody can benefit from it. So I just see so much potential. I think that, again, viewing everything from a positive perspective, I always like to think from an abundance mentality. And so I think that the more I give it away, the more I help people, the more it'll come back and the better the world will be.
And this is why I like your approach. I'm a big fan of things that are free. I have no problem with people charging for things. I think that's a good thing, and we value things a lot of times when we buy them. But,
sure.
But things like this, I love your focus on giving this away for free. And like you were saying, a lot of things I've always seen in the past were kind of gimmicks and tricks. So here's a way of memorizing all of these numbers, and I'm thinking, well, that's kind of cool, but if I reflect on it, I'm like, why do I want to memorize all these numbers?
Yeah, exactly.
What's the purpose of this? Just to do it. And I love your approach about, being very practical, and here's things that people really would want to memorize, and here's how you do it, and get better at it. So have you launched this site yet? Or are you about to launch it?
It will launch on March 1, if this isn't live by then, but yeah, it's opening on March 1. And basically people can, if it's not launched yet, people can still sign up at masterofmemory.com, but you just want to get in the loop so you can be given all the stuff. And again, all the information is going to be free. So, there's nothing you have to lose.
So one last question on this. How, for a person who hasn't been exposed to some of these techniques before, and we'll call them techniques and not tricks, because these are things that really could be impactful and helpful in people's lives. How difficult is it for people to pick up these techniques if they're not used to them? from your experience? Are there certain techniques that are harder, or is it pretty much something that anyone can do with just a little bit of practice?
It starts with recognizing that your brain only remembers things that are memorable. And that may sound silly, but unfortunately, some of the things do sound kind of silly that we have to do. So, what happens is you have to take something that isn't interesting and turn it into something that your brain will remember. Turn a series of words into a funny story, or place the events of a story along a path that you've walked down. Place these events on certain places so that in your mind you can think, I'll walk from my bed to my refrigerator, and you can remember each of those events in order because you're seeing them in your head because you've mentally placed them along that path. And like you said, people have called them tricks in the past, but they're not. They're solid techniques. People have been using these to memorize books and scripture and sermons and everything that you can think of for millennia. So it all comes down to taking what isn't necessarily memorable, like numbers. Our brains just simply aren't programmed to memorize numbers, and turning them into something that is memorable, turning a number into an image, and just making sure that you're thinking the way your brain wants to think.
So where, you mentioned this earlier, but again, where would people go to find out more information about this?
Yeah, it's all at masterofmemory.com.
Great. And your website?
My website for the podcast, my productivity website is aceproductivity.com. And yeah, all of the podcast and everything is there.
Great. Well, Timothy, it has been great fun having you on here. Love talking to you. Love what you're doing and the emphasis you're doing. Love how you're reaching out and helping people be more productive and embrace life with a greater passion and purpose. And want to thank you for all that you do, and hope to have you back on again soon, and especially maybe after you fully launch your memory project and website, have you back on, and maybe let's devote a whole episode just to talk about memory and techniques and just different things like that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
So I hope you enjoyed that interview, and if you enjoyed what Timothy had to say, go check out his site, aceproductivity.com, aceproductivity.com. Check out his podcast. Leave him some comments as well. He has a Facebook page up, and he has a lot of different types of contacts. You can get a hold of him, and definitely check him out. I think he's a great guy to know. He's got some really great insights into some things, and I'd keep tabs of him because I think he's on the verge of really doing some awesome things. His memory thing is an awesome thing, and as I mentioned in the interview, I want to have him back at a later date just to talk about that topic itself. Yeah, we talk a lot about more psychological areas of productivity, but I love learning aspects as well. I dedicate a whole podcast over learning, you might remember. So I love that, and I want to have him back to talk about the memory. So check out his memory site as well. I think that's fascinating. So again, thank you, Timothy. Thanks for being on the show. So next week, we are getting into assertiveness. So get ready, and we're going to get into that, and it's going to be a lot of fun. As always, please consider leaving me a rating, comment on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Zune, on BlackBerry, however you listen to me. I would love if you would leave me some comments, let other people know what you think about the show. I mentioned the Creative Live thing. I told you that I wasn't going to introduce that anymore at the beginning of the show. May mention it at the end of the show for the next show or two, but you can go to firstthingsproductivity.com/yes, Y-E-S, and vote for me as an instructor for Creative Live. I mentioned I would love if you could vote for me a teaching over procrastination and also statistics for the statistically challenged. Both of them would fall under their business area. I would greatly appreciate if you would consider doing that. If you have any comments on this particular episode, I have a discussion area set up at firstthingsproductivity.com/29. So until next time, remember this: your life is an adventure. Embrace it. Your life is an occasion, so rise to it. Embrace your life as an experiment. Try out things. See how things fit for you. Don't just take someone's word for it as it fitting you, but apply it and try new things and see if you can tweak this or tweak that. Find what works best for you, and don't give up on things. Keep after it. Embrace today with passion and intention, and don't die with your music still inside you.